Greetings, my fellow children of the night. So, we've got a little bit of a situation brewing in Colorado when it comes to religious liberty. And once again, we have a Wild Hunt article that we are going to discuss. Before I begin, please help support Witchcraft TV, show Harold Carter some love. Also, check out us, the satanic content creators. Give us some love over at TST TV. That is the satanictemple.tv. So, Colorado's preschool program. Welcome to the disunited states of America. See what I did there? Yeah, there's a reason for that. All right, let's carry on. Supreme Court to weigh religious exercise and non-discrimination in Colorado case. The United States Supreme Court on Tuesday scheduled oral arguments in St. Mary Catholic Parish versus Roy for November the 3rd, setting a stage for a major religious freedom dispute over Colorado's universal preschool program. While the dispute involves Catholic preschools and Colorado's non-discrimination protections, the court's evidential ruling could have broader consequences for the balance between religious exercise, access to government benefits, and civil rights protections. So, once again, the crazy Christians are back. There seems to be a very strange phenomena here in the States. People are all hyped up. They're on the Trump train or they're on the Democratic train. And what we're seeing is religion being called into question over and over and over again. Should America become Christianized? Well, that is a no-brainer, but it shouldn't be, because the Christian empire as it stands, there's a lot of issues with it. And when it comes to children should not have to be forced into one religion over another. Children should have the right to practice whatever religion that they are following. Colorado's Universal Preschool Program, known as UPK, provides publicly funded preschool for 4-year-old children through public and private providers, including religious schools. Participating providers receive state funding, but must comply with the program requirements intended to give families equal opportunities to enroll. Among those requirements, providers generally may not discriminate in enrollment based on characteristics including race, disability, religious affiliation, orientation, or gender identity. Why are we so focused on orientation and gender identity? Like, literally, why are we so focused on it, right? Why do our kids, our young here in the disunited states of America, right? Why do our young have to profess an orientation or a gender identity? Why can't they just be kids? This is part of the problem. Society in general is so hyper-fixated on orientation and so hyper-fixated on gender identity. I know that's rich coming from a transgender woman, but there are limits to that. I think the limits are, why are we placing labels onto our children? Why can't our children just be children? Why can't our children just grow up as we did, as the older generation, right? Exploring, learning the world, having fun, being out in nature, making friends, right? Developing their own characters, if you want to call it that. Why are we so hyper fixated, right? I, as a transgender woman, I'm not fixated on my orientation. I'm not fixated on my identity because I'm quite happy with who I am. But here in the States, it's a bit like you have to declare. And if you don't declare, then there's going to be problems with it. And I believe that our children should not have to declare things. They should just be allowed to be kids. There is a time and a place for identity, right? There's a time and a place for orientation, but it sure as hell isn't in childhood. I'm just saying. We have things like race, for example. This United States is still fighting a sort of brooding race war. We have this idea of religious affiliation, where, as I'm sure it will come as to no surprise to people who have viewed this channel for a long time, you're going to say affiliation really means, are you Christian or are you not? If you're not Christian, then we're going to penalize you, or we're going to make it 10 times more difficult to get accessibility when it comes to these sorts of programs, because you're not part of the status quo. This is part of the problem, is there is a large amount of society that is hell-bent on Christian this, Christian that, Christian everything. That doesn't really work in today's culture, but try telling people this and they'll be like, nah, it works, mate. What are you talking about? It's perfectly fine. As for disability, why, like, there should be equality across the board. That's all I'm going to say. There should be equality across all the board. And my job is to get you guys to think, is to get you guys to see the bigger story at play here. I find it really interesting how, and we'll read this again, among those requirements, providers generally may not discriminate in enrollment based on characteristics, including race, disability, religious affiliation, and gender identity. So what are we saying here? Are we saying, okay, but the program provides for you, but it doesn't provide for me? That, you know, that's part of the overarching problem. All right, let's carry on. 2 Catholic parish preschools in the Archdiocese of Denver sought to participate in the program while maintaining admissions policies based on Catholic religious teachings. The Archdiocese requires families enrolling children in its schools to support the school's Catholic mission, including teachings concerning oh, Jesus. Why are we focused on sexuality and gender? Why? If you're a Catholic school, you're a Catholic school. Why are we focused on this idea of gender identity? Why do we have to focus on our children's sexuality, right? It's fundamentally wrong. You know, what is going on in society where we are now teaching sexuality and gender? Why can't our kids just grow up normally and decide for themselves what avenue they want to go down? Why are we having teachings on this? The schools requested an exemption from Colorado's non-discrimination requirements, which state officials denied. This is this idea, right? I have nothing. Look, coming in with a neutral perspective, I have nothing against, you know, a lot of people call me anti-Christian. Am I? No. I see fundamental flaws in Christianity, including its plagiarized book, the Bible. But really, you know, if you're a Catholic school, why are we teaching sexuality and gender? Why? What's the point? Why not allow our children just to be children without having to worry about, oh my gosh, my sexuality goes against Catholic teachings? Well, the Catholic teachings are not kind of, see, part of the problem with the Catholic mindset is they're trying to keep up with the Joneses, but there's certain subjects which they are enforcing, which is this idea that you have to be one or the other. You have to be either male or female. Our kids don't need to learn this. Our kids just need to be taught properly with a standard curriculum that covers all aspects of not just society, but the world in general. We owe it to our children to be teaching properly. And I get it, right? I'm not saying anything, you know, Catholics can do whatever the hell the Catholics want to do. But there's certain subjects which I feel have no place in schools, which is this idea of teaching our kids about sexuality and gender. Just let our kids be kids. This is the point. Let our kids just be kids. Oh, boy. The Catholic plaintiffs, represented by the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, argue that Colorado has forced religious schools to choose between participating in a generally available public benefit and operating according to their religious beliefs. They contend that this violates the First Amendment's free exercise clause. I mean, do they have an argument, which would be the next question? They have a straw man argument. Why can't we participate in this program? But it's not a hard and secured argument. It's a straw man. Colorado sees the dispute differently. State officials maintain that religious schools are eligible to participate in UPK and that the non-discrimination requirements do not target Catholicism or religion generally. Rather, Colorado argues that participating institutions must comply with enrollment requirements governing the publicly funded programs. So the Catholics are kicking up a storm, and Colorado's like, what the hell? It's kind of weird, right? We're seeing this infighting within, like, it's kind of catty. We see this infighting between the world's religions, right? Why can't we just have education separate from religion? Religion is its own ball game, right? Why do we have to merge both together and then complain because a program may or may not fund it? All right, let's carry on. The disagreement is complicated by exemptions and enrollment preferences Colorado permits for some providers. The Catholic plaintiffs argue that the state allows secular providers to prioritize or serve particular populations while refusing comparable accommodation for religious institutions. Colorado responds that these provisions advance purposes of the preschool program, including ensuring access for children with disabilities and economically disadvantaged families, and do not amount to comparable exemptions from its non-discrimination requirements. I mean, the Catholics are coming in and they're coming in fighting, right? And again, I'm not here to flame religions. I'm really not. I could, but I'm not going to. I'm coming in from a neutral perspective. When Catholic institutions start saying who and what can be included in a program or in the field of education, that's a problem. When the Catholics decide, oh my gosh, you've got a disability, oh my gosh, you've got this, oh my gosh, you've got that, it doesn't matter if you're Catholic or not, that they're still going to be like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Do we really teach this or do we not? Do we allow them into the program or don't we? A federal district court rejected the Catholic plaintiffs' constitutional claims, and the U.S. Courts of Appeals for the 10th Circuit affirmed the decision in September of last year. The Supreme Court agreed to consider two questions arising from that ruling. The first involves Employment Division versus Smith, the court's landmark 1993 exercise decision. Smith involved two members of the Native American Church who were denied unemployment benefits after being dismissed from their jobs for sacramental peyote use. The Supreme Court held that the free exercise clause generally does not require religious exemptions from the neutral laws of general applicability. There is a lot wrong in America when we're like, no, you can't even use peyote, even though you're not harming anyone else. Oh, boy. All right, let's carry on. The Catholic schools argue that Colorado's rule is not generally applicable because the state permits exemptions or preferences for some secular purposes while refusing accommodation for religious exercise. So in other words, if you ain't Christian, there are going to be problems, mate. That's basically the gist of of what's going on. If you're not Christian, right, or if you're not Catholic, or if you're not this, or if you're not that, if you're not state recognized, if you're doing things which the state feels, oh my gosh, you're using peyote, right? We're going to deny this, we're going to deny that. if religion was free, if we did have the freedom of religion, then these landmark cases would be totally and completely different. But it raises a question, do we actually have religious liberty here in the States? The second question concerns Carlson versus Mankin. The court's 2022 ruling that Maine could not exclude religious schools from a tuition assistance program solely because they provided religious instruction. The court will consider how that principle applies when the government's objection concerns an institution's religiously motivated conduct rather than simply its identity. There's a difference between conduct and identity. You can identify with whoever the hell you want to identify. If you want to identify as a three-legged alien from Mars, more power to you. Just go ahead and identify as it. But conduct is completely different. And part of the issue with Christian and Catholic schools is they're very stringent in who's in and who's out. So they decide who can get this. They decide who can't get this, right? You know, they're kind of coming up with their own rules and regulations, which goes against what the state is actually saying. The state's got no issue with how you want to identify. If you want to identify as Catholic, okay, so be it. If you want to identify as Christian, so be it. You know, the difference between the Anglican, etc., right? But the problem comes when we're like, well, this is the type of conduct that we are going to have, where you have to fit certain requirements to fit in to the Catholic way of life, where you have to be physically fit, where you have to be, you know, where you have to say what your sexuality is. And if that goes against the Catholic Church, then, oh my gosh, you're not going to be allowed in. You know, it's almost as if there is so much infighting in the religious community between what the Catholics want, what they think that they can get away with. And we're seeing this now in the news where people are like, well, hell no, that ain't going to work. Why are you saying certain person cannot be in a program? Why are you saying certain person can't go to a Catholic school, right? You know, Catholic schools are exclusive. They sure as hell are not inclusive. They're exclusive. That's how they've always been. You know, I went to a Catholic university here in where I live, and I will tell you that it lost its identity as a Catholic university. It really did. And it lost its identity because they were being flexible. Now, certain Catholic schools are not flexible. They don't want to play ball. They'd sooner take things to court and waste everybody's time than to be flexible. All right, let's carry on. Significantly, the justices declined to answer a third question raised by the Catholic plaintiffs, whether employment division versus Smith should itself be overruled. The case, therefore, will not directly determine whether Smith remains good law, although it could substantially affect how courts determine whether government rules are neutral and generally applicable. Ah, boy, is the government neutral? I would like to, oh boy. Is the government neutral? That is a good question. Currently, I would say with the current administration, it's not neutral. The current administration is running with Christian first, but it sure as hell isn't neutral. They'll tolerate other religions, don't get me wrong, right? It's all about surface level toleration. But to argue, is the current administration neutral? Well, the answer would have to be no, because they're running with a Christian rhetoric. Everything that's not Christian is sort of not in any equations. That they're running with a certain, you know, they're running with this mantra of making America Christian again. So they sure as hell are not neutral. That distinction may be particularly important for minority religious communities. Yeah, because are we, as many pagans as there are, through all walks of paganism, we're still considered a minority. But now this raises the question: where do we as pagans fit in? What laws are protecting us? What laws are not protecting us? That this raises a serious question between what the current administration is focused on, which is the hyper-Christianization based on a national identity, versus total religious equality and freedom. But the current administration doesn't want to enter into that argument where they will have a legitimate conversation with minority groups. We're seen as minorities. We're seen as, oh, it's just those people, they're back again, right? Religious minorities at the same time should be protected. We should have equal rights. But that's not how the current administration is playing. The current administration is saying, well, if you ain't Christian, or if you're not part of the big three, then we're not going to protect you. But if you're a minority religion, oh boy, we're going to hit you with every kind of state mandate that we can think of, right? Look at all the drama with Covenstead, with Witchcraft TV. If Witchcraft TV was part of the big three, then there wouldn't have been a legal case involving Covenstead. There just wouldn't be. But look at the drama that played out. Here is Harold Carter, who establishes a Covenstead. He's not doing anything legally wrong. But then he gets hit with zoning, he gets hit with everything, has to go to court, and eventually the court rules in his favor, which is a no-brainer because he didn't violate the law. And so it's almost as if it's almost as if religious liberty right now is only focused on us and them. And we are the them. We're not the us. And therefore, this is why all of these questions are coming up. Where are our rights? Where are the freedoms and protections that we have as pagans? There should be raising alarm bells, especially within our pagan community. All right, let's carry on. The constitutional principles involved are not limited to Catholic or Christian institutions. Pagan, indigenous, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and other minority religious communities may encounter government regulations that burden religious practices involving ritual, sacred objects, religious dress, dietary requirements, holy days, or the use of particular spaces. Yeah, true. If we want to do a public ritual, chances are we'll be slapped with a city or town ordinance, or we'll get legal, or people will start complaining. Oh my gosh, they're doing a public ritual in a public space which is free to use as public. But if we try and do that as pagans, there'll be drama, right? We can just predict there will be drama. All right, let's carry on. Okay, if the court broadens the circumstances under which secular exceptions require comparable religious accommodations, minority religions could gain stronger grounds for challenging government rules that substantially burden their practices. Yeah. We have been, as pagans, part of this system where we're not in the gang. We don't have the same rights as the Christian nationalist movement, where we're seen as kind of the them. Oh my gosh, here come the minorities. We've got to hit them with ordinances. We got to, the law is going to clamp down on them. The law needs to change. We need to be covered under constitutional law. I'm just saying. All right, let's carry on. Indeed, Smith itself arose from the religious practices of a minority faith, and its legacy has long produced debate amongst religious liberty advocates over how much protection the Constitution provides when generally applicable laws burden religious conduct. But St. Mary Catholic Parish also presents the other side of the equation. Oh boy, of course they do. Of course they do. Because America suffers from this hyper over Christianization of the entire nation, where our current administration is running with Christian first, everything else second. Oh boy. Okay. Religious exemptions can affect people whom the underlying laws are intended to protect. In this case, Those protections include why are we so fixated? Question for the Catholics out there. Why are you guys so fixated on sexual orientation and gender identity? Why? What is, like, what's driving this? Right? You know, why do we have to always have sexual orientation and gender in almost every single discussion? Why are the Catholics so focused on this? We're human beings. Everyone, it's called humanity for a reason. Just because we identify and have different orientation, why are the Catholics so fixated on this? Why can't they just go back to old school rhetoric where they're actually teaching Catholic teachings without having to get our kids to declare who and what they are? Our kids should not have to be forced into declaring what their sexual identity or gender is. Because kids should, over time, this is why we are harming our children. Right? Well, not us, the pagan community, but in the Catholic community, right? We're harming our kids by forcing them into declaring who and what they are in order to fit in, where they have to be part of the Catholic mold. Now, truth be told, the Catholics they are semi-tolerant to transgender. They are semi-tolerant to the LGBTQIA plus movement, because the Pope has made a lot of strides forward to say that all genders and all identities are welcome. But why is it in our school system that kids have to declare, where we are going to teach one avenue, but we're not going to allow our kids to develop an identity for themselves? There's a time and a place to develop those sorts of gender identities and orientation, but that should not be in school. This is part of the problem. Oh boy. A broad ruling for the Catholic plaintiffs could strengthen the ability of minority religions to seek exemptions from the government requirements, while also expanding the circumstances in which religious organizations receiving public funds may decline to follow non-discrimination provisions. For minority religious communities, including those within paganism, this creates a potentially complicated religious liberty question. True, strong free exercise protections can be especially important for small or unfamiliar religions that lack the political influence of larger religious institutions. At the same time, protections against religious discrimination can be equally important to members of minority faiths who seek access to schools, employment, social services, and other publicly supported programs. The question before the court is therefore larger than whether Catholic preschools can participate in Colorado's program. It concerns where the government may draw the line between accommodating religious practice and enforcing conditions attached to public benefits, and whether exemptions created for secular purposes can require similar accommodations for religion. Yeah. Where do we fit in? Would be the next question. Where 5, 10, 15 years from now, where are we going to be fitting into this governmental policy? Where are the protections for pagans, in other words? And this is going to be an ongoing battle. This isn't just a quick, easy fix. This is going to be a lengthy battle. The Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in the case on November 3rd, a decision expected by the end of the court's 2026-2027 term in June of next year. But the problem still remains. The Catholics are running with a mantra of us versus them. They always have, they always will. They have this fixation of Catholic first, everything else second. But when they look at everything else second, they throw in all of these curveballs. Oh my gosh, you're pagan. Well, yeah, do we allow you to fit in or not? Look, there are going to be people that are like, well, why are you pagan in a Catholic school? Because Catholics, or in a Catholic university, right? Perhaps parents want to give their kids a different education. I mean, there is a lot here to unpack. But when it comes to this idea of always focusing on sex and gender and identity and all of this, I believe that that shouldn't be in our schools. I believe that we are harming our kids by guessing them or giving them labels which that child growing up may not agree with. But they have to agree with it because that's what the Catholics are saying. Well, you have to be this, you have to be that, you have to practice this, you can't practice that, you have to not learn about other religions because other religions bad. You know, this presents a very long argument when it comes to religious liberty. Now, in paganism, right, we're seen as a minority. We're seen as that kind of, well, does the government want to really fund pagan programs? Does the government really want to give us as pagans the same freedoms as the Christian nationalist movement? And then the government will probably decide, well, you know, we're gonna, you know, what I think is going to happen is government's going to decide, well, you know, we're only going to tolerate the Christians and we're going to continue to punish pagans. We're going to continue to chip away at the freedom of religion and focus the freedom of religion on the Christian nationalist movement rather than the freedom of religion encompassing everyone. That's why it's called the freedom of religion. It's not called the freedom of Christian religion. It's not called the freedom of Catholic religion. It's the freedom of all religions. Just some food for thought. Before I go, please help support Witchcraft TV. Show Harold Carter some love. Also help support satanic content creators. You can check us out at TST TV. That is the Satanic Temple TV. And I will talk to you guys later.